Thank you so much. And Nandana, welcome to JLF Boulder. For those of you who don't know, Nabaneeta Dee was really a force of nature. She was full of life. She was full of energy. She was impassioned. And she came out here to America to study in Harvard. She herself was the daughter of two very eminent poets. Her mother, I think, got married at the age of 13, if I'm not, or 12, and was again completely engaged in language and nuance and poetry. And when Nabaneeta Dee's marriage failed, she goes back to India, and in many ways that becomes the realization of her true verse, her true language. And this is something that we're going to explore today. So Nandana, thank you so much for being here. We've done a conversation previously on Acrobat online, but it's so much easier to do this and nicer to do this in person.
It is.
For those of you who don't know, Nandana is a very eminent film star back home in India. She now, of course, lives in America for the past 10 odd years, I think. But she's also a very celebrated film star. And I'm going to start with that. Nandana, your trajectory, your own trajectory has been really interesting because you went into films, you really became a superstar. Your film Black, if I'm not mistaken, was just incredible and amazing. And you then decided that literature and translation is going to be one of the things that you've chosen to do, unusual in the way the world is.
Yeah, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
I guess I don't need the handheld. You know, literature was a part of my life from my childhood. I grew up in this book-filled house in very chaotic old house, the house that belonged to my poet grandparents, with books everywhere, and poetry was a part of the way we spoke to each other. So I think film, it was interesting when I started my career as a film, which I kind of fell into accidentally, as while I was a film student at USC in LA. Gautam Ghosh cast me in his film, and I took a semester off to do it for fun, and then I never went back. But when I started working in Bombay, people would say, but you know, you are a Harvard graduate and you're a pretty good student, why do you want to be in films? And then, as if, you know, if you choose films, as if there is some kind of a clash between wanting to having a pretty engaged intellectual life and wanting to be in cinema. And then when I decided to step away and become a mom and focus on my writing, which I had done throughout this time as well, but not with the same intensity, then the question was, oh, but you know, you're an actress, you have this whole body of work, why do you want to leave that and go back to writing children's books? So I think it's very interesting. For me, writing and acting and the activism that I do with children have always complemented each other. They have fed into each other. My first children's book came out of a workshop I was doing with children who had been rescued from trafficking and the street and from child labor. And that became Mambi and the Forest Fire, which is a huge best-selling book now. Equally, the work that I did in cinema really informed the way I visualize my children's books, the way I do the storybooks, the way I want the story to unfold is in some ways very cinematic. So it has never sort of, to me, felt like there have been clear departures. If anything, it just seemed like I've been kind of someone who's been artistically confused and done lots of different things at the same time, if that answers your question.
But did you ever have a problem of pressure being the child of these two very eminent people, a Nobel laureate, an incredible poet, and of course the grandparents?
I didn't grow up as the child of a Nobel laureate. You know, when I was growing up, my mother was the superstar in the family. My dad was very well known as an academic. He was well known in the academic world. My mother, Nabaneeta Dev Sen, was a household name. People loved her work. I mean, this was before the time of cell phones, but when we stepped out of the house, everybody wanted an autograph, wanted to do a pranam, you know, etc.
Pranam is to sort of genuflect, sort of get a blessing.
Get a blessing. And so yeah, and then so my grandparents were also celebrities, right? So you're right. We definitely grew up as the kid of a celebrity home, but to the great credit of my parents, I never felt that pressure, and I think partly because they had a lot of confidence in me. I don't know why they did, because I kept making really crazy decisions and changing my life around. And any other parent would have gone, eeks, do you really want to do that? But not mine. They didn't bat an eyelid. And even when I chose something like cinema, that they really had it's not that they didn't know anything about it. They knew about it as consumers, but they didn't really understand the business. They still were not really scared for me. And I think they just somehow thought that whatever decision I make, it would all be okay. And also, this is a very middle-class Bengali family, and in a middle-class Bengali family, if your child is doing well at school, if her grades are okay, then you assume that nothing terrible is going to happen to them, right? So I think that was the thinking behind them.
You, of course, have been writing children's book before you came to translating this particular work.
Right.
But you came to your mother's work in times where she needed your help and assistance to translate from Bengali, which is the language that she chose to, and we'll come to that later, to write in. And she wanted somebody to be able to translate that, and she couldn't be bothered about translating her own work in many ways.
That's right. She was a perfectionist, so she spent hours and hours on every poem, thinking about rewriting every word and changing the punctuation marks. I mean, she called it her own writing neuroses, which incidentally, I have all of those neuroses. But she decided she wanted to write a new poem. She didn't want to go back and revisit a poem she had already spent so much of herself into. And so we ended up translating. I mean, I never saw myself as the primary translator of her work, but when I was at Harvard, she was visiting, I was in my freshman year, she was asked to do a presentation at the Radcliffe Institute of her poetry, but she didn't have any poetry in English available in English. It was already known to them that she was a preeminent poet. So then I quickly translated a few of her poems, including Antara and a few others, which had never been translated before. And that's how our kind of this project of translating her poetry always was very need-based. So, I mean, there was another time when we were asked by this lovely bookstore in Beijing called The Bookworm. I don't know if you know them.
Yes.
And they asked us to be in conversation, and my mom's new book, Tumi Monosthir Koro, had just come out, and she wanted to read some of that poetry, but of course nothing had been translated. So as we were traveling from the Great Wall of China to the Forbidden City in the car, I started translating some of those poems. So that's how the translations happened. But this book, the one that we're talking about today, is a very sweet story. My mother got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in November of 2018, and exactly a year later, she was gone. And in that year, I knew there were some things that were really important to her. And one of the things that she regretted was the fact that even though she had 100 books in print, she didn't have a book that had been published for an international audience. And she accepted that was partly her fault, because she refused to write her creative work in English. That was a political choice for her. She wanted to write. Her academic writing was in English, but all her poetry, all her fiction, all her narrative nonfiction, her plays, all of that was in Bangla. She felt very strongly about it, but what that meant is that unless that work got translated, you don't reach a world audience. So I had been I was thinking, would love for this to happen, and quite by coincidence, it actually had something to do with Jaipur, because I had done a session in Jaipur Bookmark on Make Up Your Mind, which is a book that I'd done of my mother's poetry, a much thinner book as a birthday present for her.
It was more a slim sort of collection of a few poems that she did to mark her mother's birthday. It was a gift. It was a surprise.
It was a
for her mother.
surprise gift, and it was actually a product of that ride to Beijing's bookstore, because that book, Tumi Monosthir Koro, is a very thin book. I translated that, and I translated it bilingually. I did 75 copies of it because it was her 75th birthday, so she could give them away to anybody she wanted. And then, of course, there was a demand for that, so we ended up having to print more, and publish it. Anyway, so this I did in Jaipur Bookmark, a very lovely session on that book, and a great translator who is now a friend of mine called Tessa, who was there, Tessa Ross, not Ross, Tess Lewis. Tess Lewis got that book and really liked it and gave it to Jill Schoolman, who is the founder of this amazing publisher in New York, they only do translations of contemporary and classical literature from around the world. They do not publish anything in English that has been originally written in English. So Jill found the book, loved it, and called me at this couple of days after my mother's diagnosis had come through, completely out of the blue, and says, I would love to publish a book of your mother's poetry translated by you, which was just like a dream come true at that point to me, because I had been thinking, how do I do this? And so Jill had no idea that Ma was really ill, but she rose to the occasion. My mother and I chose this beautiful painting by Rabindranath Tagore together, because Make Up Your Mind had also had a Tagore painting as its cover. And we chose the title, we signed the contract, and Jill even sent in the cover, and then 2 weeks after that she was gone. So that's the story behind this book.
You yourself, some of the poems you both translated together. Mm-hmm. You sat with your mother, some you translated yourself. Was that difficult to sit with your mother and translate? Did you have arguments? And once you answer that, I'd love you to start by reading maybe Lamp.
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem. You know, we had a very argumentative relationship, as in, how many Bengalis are here? I don't know. Yeah, a few. So then
half a Bengali.
Yeah, so you would know that a lot of the way we express our love is through argument, right? So it's not that we had a non-argumentative relationship at all. In fact, my mother and my grandmother also had a very argumentative relationship, although they were also, and their, quarrels were always powered by unrestrained love. But somehow, in this case, it wasn't that way, surprisingly, because she was very touched that I would attempt translations of her poetry with prioritizing certain things that had never been prioritized before in translations that had been done of her work. So, for instance, every poem, she was a Chande Jadokar in her own way. She was someone who was really masterful with rhyming and rhythm. So I decided when I did Acrobat that if I translated a poem that was written in rhyme, then I would translate it, I would render it in rhyme. And I would also render it keeping the metrical, the rhythm scheme as close to the original as possible. Even the way it looks on the page, because I feel the way a poem takes up space, the way the lines breathe, have a lot to do with how the lines make you feel. So all of those things I paid a lot of attention to, and she was just she loved that. So she didn't actually, so much so that, I'll tell you a quick story and then we'll read. So in fact, I'll probably read this poem called Acrobat, which is the title poem. Acrobat was one of the poems in Make Up Your Mind, which I was doing as a surprise. So I couldn't ask Ma about what her intention as a poet had been when I had a dilemma about a translating issue. So in Bangla, you will know that the third person pronoun is not gender specific. So she could be he or she.
Or they.
Well,
in today's context.
In today's context, but at that time, 10 years ago, you weren't using it. That would be seen as grammatical sloppiness. And nor could you have it. It didn't quite feel right to use the term they. So I think the world was not ready for they yet. So I made the decision to use she. And and to me, because this poem always felt like it was about the multiplicity of identities that every woman has to live through and embrace, that it felt to me like that's what she must have thought. But when the book came out and I asked her this question, when it was no longer a secret, feeling quite pleased with myself, I asked her about the poem and she said, no, I really love it. It's one of my favorites in the book. And so I was, as I said, feeling pretty chuffed and said, yes, I thought I had to make that choice, and could have been a he or a she, but of course it was a she, right? And she said, no, actually, I didn't really think about gender in this poem. I wrote this poem about the delicate balancing act that every poet has to go through when, if you have a word too long or a sentence too heavy, you are thrown off balance in your poem, which was so fascinating. It totally made sense. So then I said, Ma, I should change it. And she said, no, absolutely not, because it works brilliantly as a feminist poem, and I don't want you to change a word. But we chose the title Acrobat in part because there was this history of this sort of as an inside joke for ourselves, but also because the book works in both meanings. It is very much about the multitasking that every woman has to manage to survive, but it's also about the precision, the meticulous balancing that a poet must perfect. So, shall I read that?
Please read both Acrobat and then maybe Lamp.
Okay. I mean, Acrobat I'll read I don't have the book, but I remember it in Bangla, since we have at least a 50% representation of Bangalis. I'll read that. It's a very short poem. Madari. সে ভেবেছে খুব সুন্দর মাদারি খেলা জানে, দু হাতে সময়কে নিয়ে লোফালুফি, এখন তখন দুটোই নাচাবে দুমুঠোতে, হেঁটে যাবে দড়ির ওপরে, ভেবেছে সে সব কিছু পারে, জীবনে একবারই শুধু দড়ি কেঁপে ওঠে. Acrobat. She thought she knew acrobatics rather well, that she could juggle time with both hands, play with the now right next to the then. She would make both dance, she thought, fist to fist, and she would glide so smooth along the tight rope. She thought she could do absolutely anything at all. Only once in your life will the rope shiver.
And maybe Lamp?
The Lamp. Yeah, this is one of my favorite poems too. We can talk about it after I read it. Memories on my mother's birthday. Go to sleep now, Ma. It's way past 11. 11? It's still early then. But you must go to bed. You're teaching tomorrow. Ma sits in her easy chair, thick glasses perched on her thin nose, pale fingers clutching her magnifying glass, the statesman spread out across her lap. Next to her on the table, her flask of tea, her medicines, her fragrant betel leaf in its silver case, her brass spittoon, her cash box. Behind her on the teapoy, an earthen vase filled with her favorite white tuberoses, and a wicker table lamp weaved in Agartala. Before her, the alarm clock ticking away, her traveling timepiece. As Ma turns the pages of her newspaper, its noisy crackle splinters the quiet night. Closing my book, I come to her. As soon as I step inside, I drown in the deep perfume of those tuberoses. The nurse is dozing in her chair. Ma, please go to sleep now. It's 1:30. 1:30? She scolds. And you're still awake? Don't you have college tomorrow? Swallowing the rebuke, I keep on wheedling. You'll get sick, Ma, if you stay up like this. You must take care of your body. My body. Ma breaks into laughter that sparkles like jewelry shimmering from head to toe. How much more sick can it get? And what use is my body anyway? I go to her one more time before I sleep. It's 2:30, Ma, do call it a night. Come, let me take you to your bed. Yes, I'm coming, just coming. There's only this one tiny bit left. Reading isn't so easy now, you see. It's the gift of these cataracts. With a slight smile, embarrassed, apologetic, she buries herself again in printed words. Under the glowing light of the table lamp, with her focus on the magnifying glass, the ticking of the alarm clock fades away. As I walk back to my room, I hear her speaking softly to the nurse. No, no, my dear, don't turn off the light. Keep that lamp switched on, please. I have just one more page left. Just one more page left. One more paragraph. One more sentence. Give me one more word, dear nurse. Just one more day.
Beautiful. Much of Nabaneeta came back with both of you. Marriage had failed. She came back brokenhearted, and she decided that she would write now poetry in Bengali. It was, as you said, a political choice. Mm-hmm. And much of the work that she's done, including her work in prose, she still preferred to call herself a poet.
Absolutely.
As opposed to a writer. Tell us about her political decision about writing in Bengali and, of course, her decision where she said, I am a woman poet.
So the first, please come on in, come. The first decision was, or not, something that came out of being born to two parents and living and growing up in Bhalabasha Bari, which is now a heritage site, because so many poets and writers have gone through it and written in the place. And she was surrounded by poetry, and she wrote somewhere, only half jokingly, that she felt she was cursed by poetry, that she didn't really have a choice but to be a poet. Equally, she had a very primal need for poetry. She felt that at various points in her life, when she was going through emotional upheavals, she would have broken down if poetry hadn't been her anchor. So she had a profound and kind of compulsive relationship with poetry, and that's the reason why she saw herself as a poet, even though, in fact, her books in prose far outnumber her books in poetry. She wrote poetry all the time, for 60 years. But, poetry is naturally not as voluminous. So there were more books that were prose than there were poems. I think she also believed that poetry, apart from the kind of familial legacy of poetry, I think she also felt that there was a matrilineal legacy of poetry, a feminist legacy of poetry. I think she felt very strongly that poetry for women had a special purpose, that it was a tool for freedom. She often said that poetry is a vital necessity for women. And she gave a lot of examples of that. She wasn't only talking about educated, literary, privileged women writing poetry in the cities. She was also talking about women in the villages, the work songs of women who were working in the fields. There were the songs, the rural women's songs around India, not just in Bengal, where the stories of Sita and Draupadi have been what should I say, revised, rewritten by the women working in the fields, in people's houses, in factories, all the ways in which they have made the epic narratives their own poetry, and how that too was a way of their creating an identity and finding freedom. So this was something she felt strongly about, and that's another reason why she identified herself as a woman poet. About writing in Bengali, when she lived in London, she wrote quite a bit of poetry in English too, some of which is included here, but when she came back, she realized, and my mother had really had a lot of farsight, and she saw that she anticipated the explosion of Indian writing in English. I mean, this is in the 70s, when it hadn't really happened, when Salman Rushdie's books hadn't come out. I mean, she was very excited about it. She thought it was, the time had come for that to happen, and she followed it very, very closely, and she embraced it, and she celebrated it. At the same time, she felt that regional languages and literatures needed to prepare for it. And the way to prepare for it was to actually embrace your own language even more, what should I say, often almost obsessively, because she felt that regional languages and literatures in India were really at risk of becoming obsolete because of the Indian writing in English. And also she noticed as a teacher of students, she was a very beloved professor at Jaipur University, that young people were losing their connection to their vernacular, especially young people in the cities. There were a lot of Bengali students she taught couldn't even read Bangla. So seeing all of that, she made a choice. She felt it was a Bengali writer's duty, the regional writers were duty bound to write, even if they could write in English, and she was fully bilingual, she saw it as a kind of moral duty to write in Bangla.
But isn't it also, Nandana, that Bengali and many of the Indian languages are so much more expressive in the local mother tongue, in this case Bengali. And when you translate it, you know, the nuance, how do you capture nuance? I mean, in Bangla, for example, Naka, it doesn't quite translate into affected. Patla Paikhana can be, you know, you have a runny poo, but it's very difficult to find nuance when you translate. How did you do that? Because poetry, especially in a language as expressive as Bengali, is really problematic to find an equivalent into English. How did you manage that?
Well, first of all, I'm really delighted by the topics that you spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to translate, such as Naka and Patla Paikhana.
Patla Paikhana, yeah.
Does everybody know what that means?
So Patla Paikhana is runny poo. I mean, and every Bengali is very obsessed with the condition of his or her poo in the morning. It's a Bengali thing. And Naka, like I said, is loosely affected, but not quite.
Yeah, exactly. Affected, flirty, I don't know, right? It can be lots of different
the way it's used is different.
Yeah, so you translate it in the context. So, you know, that's true of, that's very, very true of Bangla, but that's true of many Indian languages, I think, and indeed many languages around the world. But, so that is kind of translating the linguistic nuances or the particular eccentricities and cutenesses of a language. How do you do that without taking away the cuteness? Because it's not just the word, it's also, as you said, it's not just about Rani Poo, it's the whole kind of, the whole moment that exists around translating the one Rani Poo that makes it, that you got to translate not just the words, but that kind of mentality that makes it so important for you to be able to discuss the consistency of your poo. So that kind of thing, right? I mean, I think with me, I felt that, there were lots of decisions, like the rhyming decision. A lot of poets now think that rhyming gets in the way. And I have certainly seen translations of poetry where I have thought that the rhyming has got in the way. of actually then being able to connect with the deeper truth of the poetry. But in my mother's case, there were certain things that were very clear. She loved rhymes, and not only did she love rhymes, she used rhymes to underscore emotions, to spring surprises, to express her dissent. So they were really an integral part of the poem. So I felt like I had to translate it into rhyme. And without the rhymes being childish or seeming like forced, they had to feel as effortless as they did in the Bengali. So what that meant is that there were some poems in there that I literally spent months on, and sometimes I would just scratch it and start again with a completely different approach. And sometimes I would say that in this particular, not just with the approach, not just in relation to rhyme, but sometimes they were, because of Bengali being the language it is, you can say a lot in just a few words, whereas when you translate it, it immediately becomes like a long paragraph, right? So how do you do that? How do you keep the density of the language? And so sometimes I would just take, after having worked on it to do it the more traditional way, I would sit back and say, okay, now I'm going to ask myself, this is what this poem is about. Ma wanted to write a poem on this topic, on the unreliability of language. And she wants to use the image of a bird that keeps running away with your words. So rather than following what she did line by line, let me think about how she would have written a poem about it in English if that is what she was going to do. And that's how a lot of the poems in here actually came together, rather than doing it, as a literal word-by-word translation.
Well, facetious question, but both you sisters, were you born, did you pop out sort of as intellectuals? And if you answer that, tell us a little bit about your sister and then read Antara.
I don't think I popped out as an intellectual. I think Antara did pop out as an intellectual. I can say
Antara is a serious intellectual.
She's a few years older than I am, and I think I was sort of, one reason, to go back to your earlier question, my parents didn't really worry about me or put a lot of pressure on me, was because from a young age it was pretty clear that I had a lot of different interests. I was pretty good in pursuing all of them. I did fairly well in whatever I chose to do. But
you certainly didn't conform.
I didn't conform. And so they didn't, whereas, I think my Didi was on a more traditionally intellectual path. So I think, I was a voracious reader. So I read everything. I think I read, I don't know if it's true for a lot of you. I don't know if it's just that time of life. Like, I think as what we call a young adult, right? Like between the age of 12 and 18, I think the number of books I read then, I probably still haven't read as many books as those in the years since then. Or maybe that's an exaggeration, but it just feels like so many of all the books that I've read in the world, I read at that time. However, what the point I was going to make was that I was an indiscriminate reader. Like, I would read, of course, growing up in Kolkata, you would have to read Kafka and Camus and Sartre by the time.
But was that an escape, Antara? Was your reading an escape from the larger world? Or was it just a dreamy?
I think it was. I was quite a shy kid. I was quite an introverted kid. I was not. I was confident, but I wasn't. Antara was a lot more outgoing. So yeah, I think it was a way of, I guess, sort of being comfortable with myself. But what I was saying is that I didn't read only intellectual books. I read the Kafka, Camus, Sartre that you were expected to do by the time you were 11 and a half or something. But I also read Agatha Christie. I also read Mills and Boons. I read stuff that my sister would not be caught dead reading, right? So I can't say that I
No
rolled
Enid
out.
Blyton?
Of course, Enid Blyton.
Mills and Boons?
Yeah, I just mentioned Mills and Boons. So I did, I could have at some point. My mother, she was so funny because I had a Mills and Boon phase for maybe one summer. I read like a lot of them, one after the other. And I was telling her about all of these cliches, that all the formulas that come up. And she said, you know what, you have to write an academic essay about Mills and Boons and the wet and the tropes that they use again and again and all the ways in which they are regressive, because that was my point, is like what I'd be telling these girls to what kind of love are they supposed to be expecting. Anyway, so no, I don't think I certainly cannot claim to have popped out an intellectual. I think I've always had very strong intellectual and literary interests, so they have shaped my decisions. The films that I did, all of them have a very strong layer of social and cultural consciousness. I mean, Black, that you mentioned, is about the rights of children with disabilities. Rang Rasiya, which was the last film that I did, is about religious intolerance and censorship. It's about freedom of expression. I did a film called Autograph, which is about the exploitation of women in the film industry, which is now called the Me Too movement. I did a film called The War Within, which is about a suicide bomber in New York City. That's a film that we did right after 9/11 because we were so shocked about it. That was an American film. I did a UK-US film, which is called The World Unseen, which is about lesbian love in the time of apartheid. So you see, all of them are films that are powered by a kind of political, social, quite intellectual kind of consciousness.
Do you want to read from Antara?
Yeah.
Antara is Nandana's elder sister who lives in Delhi.
Yeah. Oh, where is that? Find it. I think that would be, which section did we put it in?
The third section.
You think? Sapling of our heart. Yeah, it's in Sacred Thread. Okay. So are all of you, do you all live in Boulder? Most of you? Great. And some of you have traveled from other parts?
Yep.
You know, the only other time, this is an aside, but it's relevant, the only other time I've been to Colorado was many years ago when my mother was actually teaching in Colorado College in Colorado Springs. She was the Maytag Professor of Comparative Literature, and I was a sophomore at Harvard, and I came to spend my spring break with her, and actually we worked on a number of poems at that time, including Antara. So that it's just so lovely to be back here. And also in connection to her work. Okay, Antara. Antara, rising from deep within primordial waters, like the first sun, forever new, forever old. You made me the universe. History and prehistory file through me now, hand in hand, in constant evolution. Antara, by your blessing I have won the sacred right to enter and stand in these timeless halls of gold with my four mothers. Now, clasping your two tiny hands in mine, I hold the future in my debt through your birth. Antara, in an instant you have filled all time. By your grace, I am now coeval with the earth.
Beautiful. We've been given a sort of time up, so I just wanted to rush straight through into some of the work that you've been doing with children. You are the ambassador for They Save the Children, where we do a lot of work together on that. Tell me about why has that become such an important part of your being? And at the end of that, if you could read from Child Speak or That Girl.
Okay. I started working with children when I was not much more than a child myself in Kolkata. It was a very different Kolkata that we grew up in than what it is now. And I started working with street kids at that time, and it kind of developed. And then when I went to college, I started a teen crisis center there. So I worked quite closely with them. I also worked closely with ATASK, which was an organization that took care of families, South Asian families who were confronted with domestic abuse. So this has been a part of my life for really over 30 years. With Save the Children, I mean, and then over time my focus, I was always drawn to the issues of girl safety. So I've done a lot of work in the area of ending child sexual abuse and also child trafficking, both of which are huge problems in India, indeed anywhere in the world. So with Save the Children India, as their child protection ambassador, a lot of my focus is on how we can basically eradicate child labor and child trafficking. But the work that I did most recently was to start a project, because last year was especially devastating, the second wave of COVID, and also the cyclones hit West Bengal, which is my state. So a lot of kids lost their parents, and there was no lifeline left for them. They weren't really getting the funding they were supposed to get through the government at all. It wasn't reaching them for lots of paperwork-related reasons. So we started a program where we are now, and the response to it was so strong, I managed to raise, through the kindness of friends, so much support for it that we had originally thought we would take care of 200 orphans. Now we are taking care of 315 orphans comprehensively. Their food security, their education, having a safe home, their psychosocial support, which I'm actually very excited to that we've included that in the program, because we often ignore that. The mental health of children is not always focused on. So now we are running this. In fact, I was just there a couple of weeks ago when I went to India. I went to the Sundarbans. I've been there twice now since we set that up. But I think it's just, part of it is growing up in India. Part of it is, being raised by a family that believes very strongly in social justice and equality. And it was never really a strategic decision. It's just that I found myself working with children in need when I was a kid in high school, and I've not stopped since.
Would you like to read from Child Speak, and then we will open it out for questions and come back to the letter?
So maybe should I read from this child?
This child, yeah, or that girl, either of the two?
Yeah, that girl is actually a beautiful one.
I think that girl is in the third or the fourth section.
Okay, let's do that girl. 15 on. This is all. Okay. That girl. Sorrow had chased her. The girl kept running and running. What else could she do? She hurled the comb in her hand at sorrow, and instantly, from the comb's 100 teeth sprouted thousands of trees, a deep forest swarming with wild animals, and somewhere among the growls of tigers, in that haunted darkness, sorrow got lost. Fear had chased her. The girl kept running and running. What could she do? She threw her tiny bottle of perfume at fear, and instantly the perfume swelled into a foaming, whirling cyclone. With a deafening roar, the fierce saffron tide flooded mile after mile, sweeping away fear. The day love chased her, the girl had nothing in her hand. She kept running and running. What could she do? She gouged her heart out from her breast and flung it at love. And instantly, that fistful of heart sprang up into a range of green mountains with cascades and caves, canyons and crests, mystery reverberating in its gorges and its valleys. The shivering echo of stormy winds, the rush of waterfalls, its slopes full of shade and its peak burnt by the sun and the moon, Perhaps it was that dazzling, brimful heart that didn't allow her lover's timid love to advance and grow. She is chased now by exhaustion, empty-handed, empty-hearted. She keeps running and running. What can she do? The girl tosses behind her only a sigh, and instantly the flame of her breath sets fire to her entire past, spreading in every direction, a desert of burning, churning sands. Now the girl runs without a care, both arms held high above her head. At last, she is chased only by her destination.
Beautiful. Questions? Anybody? Others, we'll go back and have another bit of a Is that from the Bengali side or the other side? The question.
From the Bengali side. Namaste and Dhanyavad. My 22-year-old daughter was adopted from Calcutta, an orphanage in Calcutta, 5 months of age. She was born with a pen in her hand. She cannot seem to stop writing. And she's finishing up her BA this year. She's afraid, she doesn't quite know how to make a living as a writer. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts for my daughter, Grace Shanti.
Well, her name is Shanti. Well, first of all, congratulations. How wonderful that she is such a passionate and committed and natural writer. I want to tell you that I too have a daughter who's adopted from Calcutta. She's now 7. She is not as writerly as your daughter. She actually loves books, but she has quite severe dyslexia, so that gets in the way of her writing. But she loves books. Now, I would love to. Is Shanti here? Where is she
She's studying now in the university.
Studying but near here or far?
No, Sarasota, Florida.
Okay. So, I'll give you my email. I'd love to have a conversation with her. And it would be great to read some of her work. And do you feel that she it's a Bengali gene of writing, or is it something?
I do, and we also are the U.S. representatives for Child in Need Institute, which is based in Calcutta with Dr. Chowdhury's organ. Right. So she's been involved in a lot of very similar interests and passions that you have, and I thank you very much for being willing to talk with her.
So we'll meet. I'll look for you afterwards, and we'll
Botacha, thank you.
And Shanti is an amazing. She's been coming to the festival in the previous editions. Any other questions?
Dhanyavad.
So maybe we can end with you reading the letter from the end of the book, and also before that, perhaps. Nanda, tell us a little bit about what's next. Mm-hmm. Is there another children's book coming out? Is there another film? Yeah. Are you doing are you doing your own poetry? What's the new propulsion?
So there are a few things to catch you up on. I have to do the second book of Mambi, which was launched in Jaipur Lit Fest. That's the book that came out of a anti-trafficking workshop. So that, because Mambi is such a beloved monkey, I have been told, I've been lax as a penguin has been waiting for me to write Mambi #2 for years, but I got a bit distracted by Acrobat. So now I have to do that. And I'm also working on a project called Mother Tongues, which is it's a multi-generational memoir, which kind of traces the legacy the argumentative legacy of poetry in my family through my grandmother and my mother, and that is one project that I've started. And there's a screenplay that I wrote, which is called The Performer, which is set in the intersection of politics and journalism and cinema in Bombay, which there's suddenly a lot of interest in. So we'll have to see what happens to that.
Read from the letter.
You have a question?
Sure.
Great. I would love to have more questions. I don't know why all of you are being so shy.
And there's one at the back you wanted to ask as well, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's on.
Is it? Okay. I just wanted to, I'm curious about your film career. Like, how did it start? And a little, if you can talk a little bit about your films that you've worked on and how did it start? Thank you.
Sure.
Maybe we'll take one more question
Yes,
and you can answer both together.
Yeah.
The one at the back, right at the back. Yeah.
Forgive me if I wasn't following.
Just wait for the mic because all of this is being broadcast, so we need it to be.
My question is, what is or how do you describe argumentative poetry? What is that? Is it confrontational, or is it the rhetoric or the internal things that are going on in the poem? What does that mean?
That's a really excellent question. So I mean an argumentative legacy of poetry, which in our family, first of all, both my mother and my grandmother were poets. We grew up writing poetry to each other on, their birthdays. But my mother and my grandmother was also a very feisty mother-daughter relationship. They often didn't agree. They often had a lot of fights, all with a lot of love in it. And, then they wouldn't be talking to each other, but they would be sending lines of poetry up and down. They would be boomeranging between the floors of Bhalobasha, So it was that was the kind of, it was the language of poetry in our home was very closely connected also to the language of argumentation. So it's not that it was the same, but there were a kind of parallel tradition of communication within our family. But in terms of the book, I think what I'm trying to understand is that what do we learn from not only the love that existed between women who were so path-breaking in so many ways and such formidable feminists. What can we understand about what feminism means today by looking at those intimate battles of the past? Not just the agreements, but actually what the disagreements revealed about the battle, about the fissures. And I think another thing to say about it, and then I'll move on to your question, is, to me what was fascinating about their arguments was that they revealed the tensions between one's public feminism and your personal conflicts. And this is also something that I'm very interested in terms of the, and both my mother and my grandmother brought politics into their poetry in a way that not a lot of other poets did. So they were arguing for a better, safer, more equal world, for more social justice through the way they express their dissent in their poetry.
One quick follow-up. Is the conversation between, my question was, my follow-up was, is the, I've just lost it.
No worries, it'll come back.
The back and forth, is it oral, or is it oral and written, or is it, you said
a lot of it was oral and written, because at some point they would get so upset with each other that they didn't want to talk to each other anymore. But ironically, they engaged even more by writing beautiful letters of poetry, or not, lines, or they would quote poet. I mean, Rabindranath was used as an argument for and against many of their debates. And so, yeah, it's a good question. I think some of it was written, some of it was just basically a very verbal family, written, oral, yelled out. I mean, all of the above. I'll answer your question quickly, but I do want to read the letter that you asked me to read.
We actually have 2 minutes, so.
Yeah, just very short and then read.
Okay. So, it happened accidentally. I had always been drawn to cinema as a medium. I didn't see myself as an actor. And there's a very famous Bengali writer, filmmaker called Gautam Ghosh, who selected an amazing story by another famous Bengali writer called Mohashita Devi. And
both are activists, I mean, the writer
yes,
and the filmmaker.
Exactly, extremely political, and both are activist artists. And so he knew that I had an activist tendency, and he wanted me to play this part, the leading role in his film called Gudiya. So I initially said, no, this is not, but I'll be your assistant. And I went back to film school, and then he very cleverly said, if you come and agree to be my heroine, then you can also be my assistant. And I said, oh, that would be fun, not knowing that you can't do both. So I found myself on a film set, but then I completely loved what I had to do as an actor in this film. It was very new to me. It was quite scary. I was always used to using my brain. Everything that I had done so far, I had relied on myself intellectually. And this was one way of working where I had to really connect with my emotion and make it and share it. And so it wasn't that I loved it because it was easy. I loved it because it was hard. And I also got more work because then that film went to Cannes Film Festival.
That film really just took off, and even though she was a reluctant entrant into acting, it just took off and her career took off. But
That's
we're
right.
conscious, so just end with that reading of
right.
the letter.
My first semester in college. You arrived in between your conferences, suitcases and admirers in tow. Every morning, you stood in line in our noisy dormitory to claim your 3 minutes in the shower. You left after a week, just as I was getting used to finding your hip-length hair in my comb and turning every head in the 1,000-strong Harvard Union when you swept into dinner with me, gliding in like a queen, like you always did. A few weeks later, we hit midterm exams. I overslept the first day, found the showers occupied, and sprinted to the other bathroom in panic. As I stumbled onto freezing tiles and fiddled with the cranky knob that spurted cold water for red and boiling for blue, something miraculously familiar caught my eye. A crimson dot of velvet on the narrow gray wall. Your well-traveled bindi, carefully transported from your forehead and placed beyond reach of the spray. In a flash, I could hear you laugh and smell your scent. I could feel the tension in my neck melt into the mist surrounding me. That perfect circle of red gave evidence on that mildewed wall that you would always be there, far away, so close. Although there were unending demands on your time, a few years ago you had somehow managed to find several days for us to translate together my bedtime book for children, Not Yet. The book is a playful dialogue in rhyme between a mother and a daughter. A naughty little girl finds countless excuses not to go to bed. The literal Bengali translation of Not Yet is Akhonina, but you had laughed your own little girl's laugh and declared, no, the girl must be much more emphatic. She will say, Ekkunina, Ekkunina. Well, this obstinate daughter of yours kept saying to her mother in the last few weeks, Ekkunina, Ekkunina. Could you hear me, Ma? Not too long ago, I pulled a big blue book from our Kolkata shelf, 365 bedtime stories. When I opened it, out fell a red gold rush of leaves, oaks, maples, and ferns collected in London when I was a toddler. One night, as you were reading to me about Tinker Bell, I interrupted you with a technical question. What are fairy wings made of? Bird feathers or huge petals? Butterfly wings? There are all kinds of fairies, you see, you replied, just as there are all kinds of people. Do all fairies look like you? I persisted. No, my mother smiled. Fairies are very beautiful. But Ma, I protested, you're the most beautiful person in the world. You laughed, much more raucously than Tinker Bell would. Every little girl believes that about their mother, Tumpush. Well, Ma, I've grown up a bit. My world has grown up a lot. I left home as a child and made beautiful friends who became my family. In my work, I've met many beautiful faces, walked with beautiful figures. I've fallen in love with beautiful minds. You grew up too. More books published, many awards won. A few more clashes with your stubbornly loving daughters. around your eyes a few more lines celebrating years of full-throated life. Yes, we did have fights. I cried when you didn't understand. I begged you not to nag. I yelled at you when I was upset with someone else. I watched in panic as tears welled up in your ever-adolescent eyes. But I am as sure today as I was that night in London that even if you had not been my mother, even if that most precious accident of birth had by rights been the beginning of someone else's story, even if I'd met you in any of your other roles, as a poet, professor, painter, friend, or a stranger on a plane, you would still be the most beautiful person I could ever have met. At the end of Not Yet, the daughter asks, Ma, did you turn out the light? And the mother replies, yes, my dear. Now, good night.
So we should end with Ekunina, which is loosely not now, but it is the end of the session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nandana, for this beautiful session. Thank you.
Thank you.